What's good, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be looking at something that my good friend DMTR showed me a long time ago. We've done a podcast together where he shows us how to make these kinds of kicks in Ableton, but within the means of Bitwig, I'm going to show you how to make your kicks schmick, or in my case, we like to say doofs. So in essence, we're going to be learning how to take a kick that sounds like this and this into this. And as you can tell, I can layer a bunch of kicks on here and kind of just use the same processing chain once you have it set up, but you can also tweak some of the parameters and stuff to, I guess, fine tune it. So if you've been around my channel for a while, you know that I have quite a few videos on drum processing, and while I still think that those are all viable, I find that this is my favorite one that I like doing, and it's probably also the easiest once you kind of understand what it is that you're doing. The premise behind this is really just using a saturator or some kind of distortion to overblow the sound, and then you're using a creative EQ with some like compression at the end to kind of shape a kick. And it's cool because you don't really have to worry about like frequency dependent things and all that. You can literally just force a fundamental out of something to kind of create whatever tone of a kick that you want. So let's go ahead and dive into this. I will go from the very beginning, and then we'll talk about some variations that you can do at the end of the video. So for this in particular, I'm using a saturator. In the past, I've used FabFilter Saturn, I've used Trash. It doesn't really matter what you want to use. It's just a matter of really pushing the sound out as loud as it can be. And I wouldn't really worry about overdoing it because we're going to be cutting so much anyways, but the idea is that you want to try to give as much harmonics to the kick as you possibly can. So the next thing is actually pretty cool. It's something that DMTR showed me. It's using a frequency shifter with 100% mix to basically arbitrarily tune the kick or piece of percussion that you want to anything that is just kind of at random. This processing chain can be used with any means of percussion, but regarding kicks, one thing I want you to be aware of is that because the fundamental is usually a sine wave or a variation of that, the harmonics that have the fundamental can only move so far before you lose it entirely. And so like you can do some corrective stuff to where like you really start like forcing more distortion and stuff to build your own kick and whatnot. But I find that if you stick within plus or minus like 50 hertz, then you're usually okay to still use the same fundamental of the kick in its own right. In this case, I've only pitched this down by 11.7 hertz. So now we get into the crazy stuff, which is EQing like this, and this is purely for creative means. And what I've basically done is I've found the fundamental frequencies of F1 and F2, which is actually F0 and F1, and forced these to have a fundamental. And right next to it, I've kind of cut everything that's right next to that, so that way only these frequencies are kind of pushing out. And that sounds like this. Over here, this is just some stuff that I'm dipping to try to keep it from being boxy, and then I'm cutting some of the high end off because I'm wanting to make more so of an 808 out of this. But whatever tone you want, you can literally just take a peak, or a bell curve rather, and just push this up as high as you want to go. Changing the low cut, if you add a low cut, will severely change the sound as well, especially if you have like a brick wall. It will kind of like either introduce a tail or take away a tail. So for example, sometimes you get that kind of stuff, but that's kind of up to you depending on if that's something that you want or not. So the second EQ that we have is more so of a corrective means. Everything that I just super boosted, I'm kind of pulling back down a bit and then reinforcing the fundamental here and cutting more of the high end off. And you know, there's no limit to how many creative quote-unquote EQs or distortions and stuff that you want to do, but for the sake of demonstrating, I usually just use 1 or 2 EQs and then kind of go into keeping everything to be mellow from that. The Bit 8 is a bit crusher, and this is just actually helping us add some high end back into our kick. And you're not going to be able to hear it whenever I play this, but whenever we reintroduce the OTT, then that will become a little bit more apparent. But basically, you can use the clock to have different frequencies of that noise that you can use, and then you can also even manipulate this on a diffusion if you want. But for now, the clock at like 20K is fine, so just play with it. You'll know what I'm talking about. Transient Shaper is helping push out some of those transients and reinforce this a bit, and it's also helping reduce some of the sustain. If you're in Ableton, you can use a drum bus, and if you're in another DAW, then hopefully you have a Transient Shaper. There's tons of them out there. Some of them are free, but that sounds like this. And typically I might have said this before, but typically I overdo my transients whenever I'm designing these, and then I actually go back and dial them back and actually turn my drums down quite a bit whenever I'm actually producing. So I prefer to overdo it and then pull them back, as opposed to them not being punchy enough and trying to do this process. I don't know, it's just my workflow preference, but you can do whatever it is that you like. The tool is just making sure that this is all in mono, because your fundamentals should not really have any stereo. You can in your snare, but for the most part, everything that's in your low end wants to be relatively mono compatible. Otherwise you get phasing in your fundamental drums and then it just sounds like poo. But you know, hey, create stuff, you know, don't take my word for it. So the OTT is just a means of helping us bring back some of those high-end frequencies that we've lost. So we were talking about the bit crusher earlier. Now that this is on, we can kind of hear that noise a little bit more, and then we're using the time mode to again shorten the tail end of this a little bit. So this sounds actually pretty good, but it's relatively quiet. So that's when we go into the compression side of things. This is the Cytomic glue compressor. It's the exact same as Ableton's, just looks a little different, but this is our soft clip function, and then we turn the threshold down and the makeup up, and we've got ourselves a nice doof. The attack on a compressor, if you want more transient, is usually longer, and then for the release time, because I want the kick to be shorter, I'm also cranking that up as well. That's a little bit much. That sounds good to me. You might not even be able to tell the difference, but after you listen to enough kicks and snares and have made a lot, then you kind of are able to distinguish the nuance between what the difference between 30 and 10 milliseconds of an attack is, but don't worry about that. So yeah, that's pretty much what this is, and once you kind of have this chain set up, you can throw anything into this that as a percussive means. There is some variation that you can do whenever you introduce a snare or a different means of percussion, but we'll talk about that at another time. But one thing that I wanted to add during the video, as opposed to having this set up, is actually clipping your drums. So that is something that if you want them to be just like ready to go whenever you throw them in, you typically want to reach for a clipper. That's a little much, but basically what this will do is it will help tame some of this stuff in order to kind of pull back and not like be so harsh on the transients. If you know anything about crest factor, if you have something that's super transient heavy, then it can be really hard to get a competitive mix. So whenever you introduce some of this stuff, it will kind of remove some of that. You also want to be mindful about where you place this. Unless if something just changed, I don't think that that's actually supposed to sound like that. Let's try putting this after the OTT and listening to what that sounds like. Oh, there we go. Okay, so by default, our kick looks like that. If we pull this after, then we've got our transient right here, and so just be mindful about where you place this, but all you have to do is kind of just pull this down a little bit, and you've got yourself a usable kick. And again, if you want to tweak this and stuff and make it sound different, like if I want more high end in this, then I can go back and hit undo on this, so that way we've got a little bit more. And that sounds almost like a completely different kick. So within that stuff, once all the stuff is set up, you have a lot of different things that you can play with changing the frequency shift, the saturator or distortion means. Try a different means of distortion and try different EQ shapes to see what you can get, but that's pretty much all there is to making super duper kicks. Some ones that I've made that I have available for like the halftime beat kit and stuff is over here. Just some nice schmecks and doofs that all have the same kind of processing. I've just taken kicks that I own and resampled them in such a way that makes them sound completely different. But now that I've given you the secret, that's all there is to it, and hopefully that was informative to you guys. Big thanks to DMTR for showing us this stuff. He is a wizard at drum design and has definitely helped me with my own productions and stuff. And if you guys have questions, then you can leave them in the comments. You guys can join the Discord, or you guys can reach out to DMTR. He's a super nice guy. And that's pretty much all I got for you guys. Go buy that pack. Go download the free pack that I just came out with. Go listen to my music, blah, 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 advertisements. And I will see you guys later.